When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary, for the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. The young Victor moves from being a prodigy to being a disciple, possibly an apprentice, as he finds a professor willing to take him under his wing and under his tutelage. What could possibly go wrong? Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. We are here for the third chapter of Frankenstein in a chapter-by-chapter read-along here on the channel. This video will have 3 separate sections: a So What Happened recap, a literary criticism section where we talk about all of the literary goings-on in this section, and finally, a writer's corner portion of this video. So, what happened? Victor turns 17 and is set to go off to the University of Ingolstadt. But shortly before he is to leave, Elizabeth gets scarlet fever, in a bad way. Against all advice, Victor's mother tends to Elizabeth, who recovers. But his mother falls ill and dies. Victor's departure is delayed as he and Elizabeth mourn. Ultimately, Elizabeth steps up for the family in time for Victor to leave. Unfortunately, his buddy Henry is denied the college experience by his father. Victor leaves and he experiences trepidation about being separated from everyone he's ever known. But soon he realizes the opportunity to learn at university will be unlike anything he's ever experienced, having always been such a curious person, you know? The morning after he arrives at university, he decides to introduce himself, including meeting with M. Crimp, a professor of natural philosophy. Crimp continues by chastising Victor for having studied the alchemists. Eventually, Victor steps in on a lecture by M. Waldman, who teaches chemistry, and Victor seems smitten. During this lecture, Victor is stirred to the extreme, awoken to the macro possibilities of science. Awoken, he's reborn, herein referring to himself for the first time as Frankenstein, a man of his own. Then he goes to visit Waldman and tells him about his love-hate relationship with the alchemists, and Waldman does not chastise Frankenstein. Instead, he acknowledges the giants on whose shoulders the current scientists stand. Waldman accepts Frankenstein as his understudy, or disciple, as he calls it. There are 5 big ideas in this chapter worth talking about as far as literary merit are concerned. One of them is a beautiful, beautiful irony, which operates on sort of a meta level from this text, and the other is another of the 5 is one of my absolute favorite quotes of all time, a quote that seems to work itself into the very pages of Frankenstein itself. But let's start here by talking about scarlet fever. Scarlet fever is not something that we have to contend with particularly often in today's world, but it is something that was at one time a very, very big deal. Coming to us from mayoclinic.org, what is scarlet fever? Scarlet fever is a bacterial illness that develops in some people who have strep throat, also known as scarlatina. Although I have dated a few Latinas, that scarlet fever would be a very, very rough nickname for them, but something which might fit. Scarlet fever features a bright red rash that covers most of the body. Scarlet fever almost always includes a sore throat and a high fever. Now, We also get this from newsmedical.net. Scarlet fever was common and occurred as epidemics in the 1800s. The death rate from scarlet fever then was as high as 150 per 100,000. These days, with available antibiotics, the severity of the infection has reduced dramatically. There has been a marked reduction in the incidence of scarlet fever over the last 10 years. This provides us a beautiful irony, maybe the inciting incident in this novel, maybe the inciting incident that sends Victor off to college with a chip on his shoulder, right? He knows he's got to go out here and really prove himself now. He's lost his mother. This incident springs from a disease which would eventually be eliminated, or basically eliminated, within about 100 years by the advent of antibiotics. The preeminent science fiction novel includes as its inciting incident something which would not be solved by science for another 100 years, but was foretold as a motivating factor in this novel. Very interesting, and interesting as well because antibiotics, if I'm remembering the story correctly, were kind of discovered as an accident. It was a petri dish which was set aside in a separate experiment which started growing basically penicillin. And then experiments were done, etc., etc. But it was an accident of science that antibiotics were discovered. This novel is going to have a little bit of serendipity along the way as well. There is some serendipity into the chance of discovery, and the novel itself, I mean, just what a beautiful meta level irony, an irony outside the text itself. Mary Shelley set this novel up with scarlet fever as a thing which would prove a scourge to Victor Frankenstein, the ultimate scientist at heart, and it is a problem that science would later solve. Now, moving forward in this chapter, there is a reference, a literary reference. You know, one other character from fiction which referenced poetry a lot was Hannibal Lecter, but we have this from Victor as he's leaving for college. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces. Old familiar faces in the text has quotations around it. Why does it have quotations around it? Well, because it is a literary reference. Frankenstein is pointing to this poem, a poem from Charles Lamb called Old Familiar Faces, which reads as such. I have had playmates, I have had companions. In my days of childhood, in my joyful school days, all are gone, the old familiar faces. I have been laughing, I have been carousing, drinking late, sitting late, with my bosom cronies, all are gone, the old familiar faces. I loved a love once, fairest among women, closed are her doors on me, I must not see her, all are gone, the old familiar faces. I have a friend, a kinder friend has no man, like an ingrate, I left my friend abruptly, left him to muse on the old familiar faces. Ghost-like I paced round the haunts of my childhood. Earth seemed a desert I was bound to traverse, seeking to find the old familiar faces. Friend of my bosom, thou more than a brother. Why wert thou born in my father's dwelling? Why wert not thou born in my father's dwelling? So might we talk of the old familiar faces, how some they have died, and some they have left me, and some are taken from me, all departed, all are gone, the old familiar faces. This poem is being given to us. Now, it's important to note, this is in past tense. The novel itself is written in past tense. Our speaker, our narrator, Victor, knows what happens in the future. He is reflecting upon the past. So is it any wonder that when he tells us about how he loved his brothers, he loved Elizabeth, and he loved Clerval, he loved these individuals, and then he references a poem that is about abandonment, that is about isolation, that is about loneliness. He gives us a poem which references the speaker himself as ghost-like, a poem that references having loved a fair young woman whose doors are now closed and he cannot see her. Is this an accident? Why do we have this poem set up here from our speaker talking about all of this isolation, all of this abandonment, all of this loneliness, all of this, which at one point he has a friend that he leaves to think about the past. So some of this action is not just by chance. Some of this abandonment is certainly forced by the speaker himself. Interesting poem, and maybe another irony here, if we're allowed to divulge into this, if we're allowed to sink our teeth into it. Have you ever heard of this poem before? Through all of my volumes of poetry, I don't think I've ever read it. I don't think I've ever seen it. Simply pulled it up for this novel because it has a reference in here. Meaning that this poem, this piece of literature, has been kept alive long past the time when it likely would have expired, when it likely would have died, when it likely would have been no more. Frankenstein keeps it alive. Frankenstein gives a little bit of juice to the life of this poem from Charles Lamb. A poem that, it's a good poem. It's a poem that I don't think I've ever read the sentiment behind this poem in any other poem. Maybe in short stories, this sort of melancholic idea of abandonment is fairly prevalent through a little bit of Hemingway. I would say that it's probably there in Faulkner. I would say that maybe that entire era of writing really enjoyed this idea. The World War I poets seemed to enjoy the idea of abandonment and isolation. But I don't know that I have ever seen this quite expressed in poetry. So it is a poem that is being kept alive by Frankenstein. The next thing I want to talk about here is this. We have the hubris of the institution on display. And this is going to lead into the next point too. But we have the hubris of the institution on display here when Frankenstein goes to talk with M. Crimp. And this is as he has told M. Crimp that he studied the alchemists. M. Crimp says this: "Every minute," continued M. Crimp with warmth, "every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies, which you have so greedily imbibed, are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient. I little expected in this enlightened and scientific age to find a disciple of Albert Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew. Here's the interesting thing here. Well, first off, Frankenstein is being set on the Sigma grind set, bro. You've got to start everything all over. But also, I think that sometimes, look, I don't know where I got this. I don't know if I made this phrase up. I don't know if I got this from someplace hokey. I've read a lot of hokey stuff in my day. I've listened to a lot of hokey stuff in my day. Want to grow? Forget what you know. That was essentially a lesson that comes to me from a psychology professor that I had when I was trying to get my associate's degree at community college. He told the story as such. He was a psych major, and little scrawny guy, didn't really have a whole lot of friends, but somehow, one semester in his college days, he got in good with some of the football players. That was pretty cool. And one of the football players had a convertible. That was real cool. So here he was with these 3 football players sitting in a convertible, riding down the street, looking real cool with the football players, yeah? And the car pops a flat. Bop, 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 bop. Well, of course, he's the scrawny little guy. He's not getting out. It's going to be the football player. So the football players get out, and they try to change this tire. They're trying the lug nuts on this tire. They've got the jacks set in place. They're pulled over to the side of the road, got the hazards on, everything, and they can't get the lug nut started. Well, maybe that one's too tight. Try another. So they try another. Too tight. Try another. So they try another. Can't do it. Well, it wasn't his car, the football player. It was his father's car. So they had to also be safe not to strip the lug nuts, not to damage the tire. They wanted to change it before he knew anything was amiss. So they were panicking now. And they were exhausted. And they told my professor, just go give it a try, man. Just go give it a try. Well, here he is, 140 pounds compared to football linemen, 300-pounders. What is he going to do? He steps out of the car and immediately starts one of the lug nuts. Just starts turning it, and it comes off. And the football players, he pulls up the lug nuts. This is what we're trying to get off, right? Confused. As were the football players, the big, tough, strong football players. Didn't understand what was going on. Well, it turned out that with this one model of this one car in this one year, all of the lug nuts, all of the screws, all of the bolts had the opposite threading. So lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, yeah, except for this one car, this one time, from this one year, in this one make. So those big, strong football players never even thought, well, it's lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Let's just try turning it to the right and seeing what happens. Because they all knew, rightly so, that you turn it to the left. So, not having any assumption at all, he came along and was exactly right. The problem is, with today's university, with today's academe, with the institutions of anew, you are not allowed to forget what you know. You are not allowed to start from square one. You are not allowed to stop and take things from first principles. Everyone before you that has done work on this, and they're correct. They've double-checked. But what if they're not? Or what if they are right, but for the wrong reasons? We're not allowed to check. You have to take for granted everything that has been told to you. And this leads us into So basically, the point I'm making about that with M. Crimp is the hubris of academe, the hubris of the establishment, the hubris of the official, what is allowed to be in academe, the institutions themselves. They spit upon what has come before them. Here we have Frankenstein. We have Frankenstein who has gone all the way back to square ones of science before it was known as science. And the alchemists, all of this stuff that is not right. You can't do all of that. That's all silliness. Well, maybe. But what if there's some kernel of truth in there? Because what happens is that, and this is what we're really going to get into with number 4 here. What happens is all of our academe has taken us to a certain point. Books have to be written this way in literature. Short stories have to follow kind of this formula. We have to point to things, symbols from the Bible. If we are writing in the Western canon, we have to accept that X, Y, and Z if we're pursuing battery technology, if we're going after a chemistry degree, all of these things. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, but you can only trust the giants that you can see so far back. Before that, that's useless. And so we've gotten to this point where we are. But you can't go any further, maybe. You can't go any further with the establishment that we have, with the institutions that we have. We're hitting walls. We have this. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. This is coming from Frankenstein. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for the realities of little worth. Frankenstein is saying the realities that I'm here in the university with, that I'm here in the university for, they're very small ideas. The alchemists may have been incorrect, but boy, were they bombastic. Boy, was that fun. It was nice to follow these things. Instead, I have this terrible reality. And then M. Waldman, the professor who eventually takes him under his wing, says this: the ancient teachers of science, said he, promised impossibilities are performed. Let me start again. The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera, but these philosophers, whose hands seem only to be made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscopes or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. So, the professor here is saying, no. Hold on. It may be true that it looks like all we're doing here is little bits and pieces. But man, there's some other stuff to be had. You just got to know where to look. It's almost as if Waldman sees someone buying a caffeine drink and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, are you sure those are the drugs you want? Because I got the real stuff back at my place." You can, if you just want to pep up, if you just want to wake up a little bit, go ahead and drink the caffeine drink. But baby, I got something that'll put a number on you. It's almost like dealing drugs to someone through their scientific love. We have here a quote from Eric Weinstein. I believe it was his second appearance on the Lex Friedman podcast. It reads as such. He's talking about this same idea about, do you want to pursue your passions in the ivory walls of academe, or do you want to pursue your passions on your own with freedom? But Eric tells us this: oh, it's a terrible choice, a terrible choice. If you do it inside academics, you are forced to constantly show great loyalty to the consensus, and you distinguish yourself with small, almost microscopic heresies in general. You want to be a writer. Yeah, you can do that, but you can't be too weird. If you're too weird, no one's going to accept you as a serious writer. Yeah, you can be a microbiologist, but you can't have theories that are too far out there, and you certainly can't prove them all at once. You can just nibble at the edges of things. When you go outside, you meet lunatics and crazy people, madmen. And these are people who do not usually subscribe to the consensus position and almost always lose their way. So outside of academics, if you want to do that, you're not going to have any peers. And if you do find peers, they're going to be crazy people. Writers who do not assume the traditional paths of being a quote-unquote writer. You don't want to be a writer and a professor. You just want to be a writer and have another job, a different job than academe. You're going to be a crazy person. You want to pursue microbiology but not be a professor? How are you going to do that, jerk off? All of these things are absolutely the questions that are asked as you're leaving academe. And the key question is, will progress likely come from someone who has miraculously managed to stay within the system and is able to take on a larger amount of heresy? So, a breakthrough comes in battery technology. Is that going to come from someone who has stayed inside academe and is forced to run the same experiments as everyone else, but with a slightly different element, with a slightly different X, with a slightly different Y, with a different starting place on their graph? Is that where progress is going to come from? That is sort of unthinkable, in which case that will be fascinating. Or is it more likely that somebody will maintain a level of discipline from outside of the academics and be able to make use of the freedom that comes from not having to constantly affirm your loyalty to the consensus of your field? This is such a beautiful quote from Weinstein. It feels as if this quote is a summary of the novel of Frankenstein itself. Frankenstein gets to college and is told, look, shut up and read your books. Don't do too much thinking on your own. There's some time at the end of your degree where maybe you'll be able to put 1 and 2 together, but until then, shut up and take your tests. And the other side is telling Frankenstein, hey man, we can do the real stuff. But it gets wild. It gets wild, and you might not survive. Here we have a quote from Weinstein telling us the very same thing. Inside academia, you'll have a nice job. You want to be a professor and write books on the side? That's nice. You'll have a job. You'll probably get your books published. But when you are outside the ivory walls, boy, you got to gamble. You want to live, don't you? It's going to be real wild. It's going to be very hard. Maybe you can do it, but you're going to have to be super original. You want to revolutionize science from the outside? That's what Einstein did. Einstein's miracle year, Annus Mirabilis, where he published 5 papers that revolutionized science, proving Brownian motion, E equals mc squared, the theory of relativity, etc. That happened while he was a patent clerk. He was working in a patent office. He wasn't a professor. Oh no. He was a wild man in the woods. The last thing that I want to talk about here, in the closing paragraphs of this chapter, I am happy, said M. Waldman, to have gained a disciple. Now, disciple is a simple word. It has a Greek etymology. It simply means learner. But I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone in the western part of the globe that does not assign to the word disciple a religious connotation, a religious meaning. And what would be a better type of overcast for a novel than religion when we're talking about the very core of religion with a soul? If you have a soul and you die, your soul goes to heaven or hell. But what if, instead of God inspiring that pregnancy, it's someone being brought back to life? From whence does that soul spring? That is all I have here. The Writer's Corner portion of this video will be brief. There is but one note that I have from this chapter, and it is countenance. Now, not a terrible word, but we're going to see through the course of this novel, this word will be grossly abused. There were 4 times that this word was used in this chapter. I believe the chapter is 7 pages, 8 pages long. There's every other page. And I guarantee you that in the entirety of the rest of your life, never have you read the word countenance 4 times. In everything else that you've read combined, you have not read the word countenance 4 times total. It is going to come back in this novel. The real danger here is overuse of words. Mary Shelley in this novel will become addicted to the words but and as well. However, those are not quite as insidious as is the word countenance. It's a word that's going to creep up on the author, it seems, because the author is trying not to go onto the body. It was a frank countenance. It was a strange countenance. This is a language that is being used as opposed to saying his jaw was set and his lips were terse, his brows had furrowed, whatever it is that goes onto the actual body in order to give your reader a visual of the individual in question. It's not a terrible word, but again, it is a word that is strange. Now, strange in our parlance. I haven't read too many novels from this era. Countenance surely was a more common word when Shelley was writing this book, but it is a stark reminder to us today that there's going to be something in our very own lexicon that is sort of a strange word that would set readers off to read time and again. The way that countenance, I promise you, is going to become abrasive in the course of this novel, is why it is important to do a couple things. One, know a lot of words. One thing that, for example, Stephen King does not get credit for to the degree that he should is that Stephen King, especially early in his career, would whip out a word from absolutely nowhere, but it was the perfect word and placed beautifully. Knowing more words helps, but also there is something called burnt tongue. The burnt tongue type of writing. And what this really is talking about is using a language that is unique to yourself, and you do this by getting away from cliche. You use this by going on to the body. You use this by getting away from words that replace many words. words that replace several words at a time, like countenance. Countenance basically means face, but it is facial expression, and instead of describing a facial expression, what we're doing by using the word countenance is giving a one-word summary of the face and then appending the word countenance to it. So instead of describing the strange face that someone is making, we get to wriggle out of that by using a single word, a pair of words: stressed countenance, strange countenance, things like that. So by going onto the body, we also give a stronger account to our reader, and we give them a real experience going onto the body and describing what someone's eyebrows are doing, that someone's lip is twitching, that you've never seen someone keep gesturing the way that they are gesturing right now. It does inflate a word count to go onto the body, but it gives your reader a unique experience that's only going to come from your mind. Mary Shelley says, frank countenance, what you vision is going to be different than what I see when I read those words. That's fine, but we're not all going to get the same experience from the novel.